paper I'm going to give touches on patristic material, but it's not specifically limited to patristics. It's more, after you've read these people for 45 years, what do you get out of it? Okay? And so part of what I'm going to say a little bit will be about them directly, but mostly it is what you get out of it. And I'm doing this, the what you get out of it part, because I'm getting out of it. I'm going to retire after 35 years of teaching students. And I'm just going to write and sleep simultaneously. So the genesis of this course, of this essay, genesis, a little joke. Okay. The genesis of this paper is that about 20 years ago, when a few of you were not yet born, I would have students come up to me and they would say, well, I'd have students who never came up to me and said, Dr. Barnes, my life is going so well. My career track is going. My love life is great. Love my family. The world is beautiful. I can't believe that there's a God that would allow this. Okay? The problem of God's bountiness never seemed to trouble anyone. The problem of evil in the world troubled people quite a bit in a number of ways. And so I invented a course which was called Good and Evil, Mostly Evil. and that's been part of my research and thinking for the last 20 years or more. And if you look at the bibliography I've handed out, most of it will confirm the impression that you can ask the question, this guy does patristics? So I've put on the board an outline. It's as close as we get to bullet points, okay? And in the second part, there are 3 sections. If I'm running too long, I'll drop 1 or 2 of them. There is a conclusion to what I'm going to say, I promise. I do come to the end. There is an initial review at the beginning for the people at CTI, because what I'm going to say depends upon things that have been said before amongst us. And so that can bring everybody up to the same place. So that's the basic structure. The other thing which I am required to announce to you is this does not constitute a commercial endorsement, neither by me nor by Wheaton. It simply happens to be, and it's diet, it simply happens to be something for me to drink, which I need. So I have no stock in McDonald's, getting nothing out of it, but I should. Okay, here we go. By the way, how many of you know who Ray Charles is? Hands? Okay, those are the people who are going to heaven. Okay, you know who Ray Charles is? You recognize the title, right? You don't know who Ray Charles is? I'm sorry. I mean, we gave you a chance. God gave you a chance. You truly were born to lose. Okay. In the past 3 years, the Chicago Theological Initiative has, as a group, reflected upon a succession of 3 problems. starting with the Christian understanding of death, then the Christian understanding of the afterlife, and this year we are reflecting upon the experience of evil in a creation which Genesis 1 tells us God saw as good. These experiences come to us as we live our mortal lives in a material world, boys and girls living in a material world. A material life that Genesis 2 describes as given to us by God. Our lives begin with some mysterious union of spirit and body, and our lives end in a departure of that spirit from body. That departure is simultaneously self-evident and totally baffling. If you've ever seen someone who's freshly dead, you know it's self-evident. If you've ever watched someone die, you know it's baffling. We know the how of death, but all too often the why or the when is brutally unexpected or destructive of our sense of order. We expect death, but we do not anticipate it. Death, either our own or that of others, especially of those we love, is our most private, most intimate experience, although, almost paradoxically, it is in every way what we have most in common with everyone else. Years ago, when I was an undergraduate, I was told that Teilhard de Chardin said that. Obscure reference, number one. But I've looked through Teilhard's writings and I can't find it, so I was lied to. As we have explored our Christian understandings of death, the afterlife, and the experience of evil, we have drawn upon the resources of that group of early Christian theologians, popularly known as the Cappadocians. We read Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Macrina, Gregory's Dialogue of the Soul and Resurrection, and his big brother Basil's Hexameron. Gregory's little book, Life of Macrina, is in fact primarily about the occasion of his sister Macrina's death. Though in the course of the story, Gregory tells us about his family's experience of the loss of two brothers as well as his own experience of his sister dying. The virtue Macrina herself displays is principally that of calm in the face of calamitous emotional loss. The book On the Soul and Resurrection is an attempt to define the unity the soul shares with the body, a unity which enables powers and activities to travel from one to the other, back and forth. Gregory expresses the at that time, traditional concerns about the effects of materially driven passions on the soul. Gregory then describes the process of resurrection as an example of the soul acting upon the body. Finally, Basil's sermons on the 6 days of creation are a reminder that all creation is a good gift from God. We live in this material world. It is helpful to be reminded, amidst all these painful disturbances, that the world is a gift to us from God, given in love. I think that if we were to artificially unify these three writings as a trilogy, the way movies are often artificially unified as a trilogy, then we could accurately say that Basil's sermons, read after the two works by Gregory, take up the same task as Leibniz does in his Theodicy. To call this creation the best of all possible worlds in the way Leibniz does is to say that when God gives us something, he is not cheap or unmotivated. This universe is not the dollar store version of created. It has God as its brand name. As I turn to my own thoughts, I want to begin by offering some distinctions that I think will be relevant for talking about experiencing evil, especially given that we are coming here tonight with so many different conceptual backgrounds. Among us, the subject evil and the experience of evil can be taken to refer to very different aspects of human life. For some, the train of evil is mapped according to the limits of our autonomy, whatever one takes those to be. Theodicies, as a genre, are usually deployed with this understanding of evil. For others, evil appears as monsters located on the treasure map to recovering rings of power. Modern political theologies work with such a map. For still others, evil is a force so powerful and ungoverned that it must be accorded a life, if not a mind, of its own. This form of radical dualism is more at home in modern theology and thought generally than is generally admitted. Finally, for me, in this paper, evil denotes that open-ended set of events that cause us injury, pain, and enduring trauma or suffering, to borrow a word from this afternoon. Typically both physical and emotional pain, but often only the latter. The paradigmatic cases of this kind of pain are events which occur beyond our control. Some modern theologians try to connect this last category of trauma from events beyond our control with the first category of limits of autonomy, or the second category, political theology, through the conceptual device of what is technically called consciousness. German is Bewusstsein. Particularly species consciousness as opposed to individual consciousness. Theories of lament, theologies of lament, sometimes get used this way too. I explicitly reject such theoretical connections or co-opting among these three, though what I am saying here tonight could be understood as falling within a rubric of a certain kind of theology of lament. The principal occasion of sin is passion, and it is chiefly in the mental state of passionfulness, if that's a word, that we experience evil, either as the agent of that passion or the object of that passion's energy. Someone who is swept away by a passion experiences evil, say the evil of anger, and sins through assent to that impulse. But we can experience evil outside the realm of category and sin and the experience of lament or grief. For example, the category of defilement. The exemplary scriptural case of the experience of evil outside the category of sin is Job. The exemplary classical case of evil outside the category of sin is Oedipus. The case of Job, I'm going to assume it's familiar to most of you. The reason why I would introduce Oedipus as a case of the experience of evil outside the concept of sin, I don't expect to be so familiar. If the case of Oedipus is known at all, it is that of the story of a man who unknowingly killed his biological father and with equal unknowing married his biological mother. This is the story made famous in Sophocles' play, Oedipus the King. Much less known, but of greater moral interest, is the middle play of the Oedipus trilogy, the play which in fact Sophocles wrote last of the three. In this play, which is entitled Oedipus at Colonus, the old, blind, homeless, and defiled Oedipus wanders into Athens led by his oldest daughter, Antigone. When Oedipus's identity becomes known and the citizens would turn him out, he argues that while it is true that he killed his father and married his mother, breaking two powerful taboos that leave him impure and profane, he is not guilty of any crime. Oedipus struck in anger at the older man in self-defense, not knowing who the man was since he had never met his biological parents. Similarly, Oedipus married Queen Persephone. Persephone is the Greek word for cougar, with no knowledge of who she actually was. She invited him to take the throne beside her after he killed the Sphinx. None of the horrible things that Oedipus did were done intentionally and with full knowledge, and therefore, Oedipus argues, he is innocent. Some of us would be driven to think of this situation as the Attic Greek predecessor to the question of whether or not Bucky Barnes, the Winter Soldier, is guilty of all those murders, or is he innocent even though he did it. Like the book of Job, Oedipus at Colonus ends with an ambiguous theophany in which communicates the god's judgment in Oedipus's favor. Paul Ricoeur, among others, argued that the book of Job represents the moment in Israelite religion when suffering ceased to be explained as divine punishment and the way was opened up for the categories of intention and guilt. The play Oedipus at Colonus represents the same kind of crisis as perceived in a different language tradition. Without disallowing the reality of Oedipus's need to be purified, Sophocles raises up a new perspective on suffering in life. This evil that Oedipus suffered is not a punishment for his own guilt. The horrible acts that Oedipus committed were without choice, and the evil he suffered could no longer be construed as divine punishment. Why then do we suffer evil? I must be clear and definite with you and say here tonight that I am not interested in the category of sin. While it is certainly true that I am in some ways opening up the category of evil, it is also true that in at least one other way, I am for the present closing off or bracketing the category of evil from general concerns around expressed sin. Sin in its proximate sense is not my subject tonight. I want to avoid, at least for the moment, being in a theological and philosophical analogy with arriving at the scene of a serious car accident and the first words out of my mouth being, all right, who's responsible for this? That question immediately arises not out of anyone's callous humanity, but due to a strong belief that in every case of evil, the most important thing to determine is who is responsible, who or what is the causal agent. But the pressing obligation to determine a specific evil's causal agent has limited fruition for a Christian. I'll read that one more time. But the pressing obligation to determine a specific evil's causal agent has limited fruition for a Christian. Augustine made this point long ago. Dietrich Bonhoeffer reaffirmed this point not so long ago. When the apostles ask, "Tell us, Rabbi, is this man blind because of his own sins or the sins of his parents?" they reveal that they are deeply off track with Christ's revelation and redemption. Truly modern restatement of the disciples' question would be, "Tell us, first citizen, is that man blind because of his faults, the faults of his parents, or because of reactionary Bewusstein?" In short, I find the sin-oriented account of evil in our lives dangerously open to the risk of not only the cliche of legalism, but the greater and more destructive risk of the prideful confidence and self-indulgence of romanticism. Working only with the grammar of right and wrong, of innocence or guilt, is too often a project of overriding experience with a new narrative, turning the tragic into the romantic, or into the scientific, or into the post-colonial. Modern Christian theology has never come clean about its hot and heavy romance with German Romanticism. In Romanticism, when we turn to reflect upon life as we experience it, there is a rush induced by the genre itself to get to the good parts. However, if Augustine is correct, then the good parts of our life, the best parts in which grace is received, are recognizable only in recollection. In reality, the experience of the good parts often turns out to be barely distinguishable from the experience of the bad parts, except in recollection. Some experiences are so emotionally explosive that morally all they leave behind are the shadows of where our sense of right and wrong were when it happened. It would be only slight hyperbole for me to say that what I'm offering here is the preamble to a preferential option for the tragic, but that is, for a certain pool of language, what I'm doing. For a different pool of language, what I'm going to talk about is all our griefs he had to bear, rather than the all our sins part. So drawing upon a number of texts, sacred and otherwise, I hope to make 3 points. First, that evil exists for us primarily in the realm of our personal experience. An experience is an event. It can be active as well as passive. By saying that evil is a personal experience, I do not in any way mean to suggest any kind of relativism, as if I were saying evil is a matter of individual judgment. When I say that evil exists for us primarily in the realm of our personal experience, I mean that there is a difference between, to use a Shakespearean trope, the truth that if pricked, all humans will bleed, and the truth that only some specific individual is at any given moment bleeding out from a wound. While we are not merely spectators of each other's humanity, we are and always will be spectators to the injuries each human suffers. And more to the point, no other human can share in any individual's experience of evil. This fact is observed in any loss or violation someone may experience. It is especially observed in the particular experiences of a person's memories or that loss of violation. The radical singularity of the experiences of evil is undeniable when we consider that the more traumatic or painful experience of an evil often occurs in an individual's memory of that event rather than in the event itself. If you take PTSD, people who've experienced PTSD, often the experience as they remember it provokes a greater pain than the experience at the time, since their mind was busy at the time keeping them alive and safe. With all due respect to Gabriel Marcel and others of his generation, I think it has become very clear in the last several decades that the axiom, feeling is a form of participation, lacks traction in the real world. In this regard, the phenomenologists lost out almost completely to post-Marxist critical theory. Only recently has phenomenology attempted to insist that it has content for theology, as we see in the work of our neighbor, Jean-Luc Marion. The second point I hope to make is that the experience of evil is unavoidable, or as Augustine once put it, the only way to free ourselves from monstrous experiences would be to become a monster ourselves. The very fact of being biologically alive is all by itself a guarantee that we will suffer some evil. The effects of a faulty biophysics, which leaves a weak-walled blood vessel in the brain, which one day will simply burst like a bad plumbing job, or an intimately placed IED, such as a genetically triggered disease, or the evil of our involuntary servitude to the physics of acceleration and force, under which a body falling 100 feet is nothing more but than a body inclined, like any other material body, to continue in motion until it meets the obstacle which brings about instant deceleration. Whether or not one believes that our liability to evil lies wholly in the fact that we live material lives, or in our contingency, or in thrownness, Orphanheit, for those of you who are reading the German subtitles, the fact that we are embodied creatures does indeed set us in a realm in which great emotional and spiritual trauma can be visited upon us through our body, a fact that the old Acts of the Martyrs, like that of Perpetua and Felicity, makes clear. I explored the connection between our animal selves and suffering in an article I did called Snowden Secret, which I wrote 6 years ago for a Festschrift dedicated to a friend and colleague, Ralph Del Colli, upon his unexpected death. Ralph was diagnosed with liver cancer on June 22nd, and he died on July 29th. It was a very good example. The third point I hope to make is one that I've already begun to advance. If we regard evil as a kind of experience, then what qualifies as evil is, from my perspective, much more than what many theologians regard as evil. I obviously include any sort of traumatic physical suffering, all forms of emotional or physical violation, and every occasion of loss that results in grief. By thinking of what is to be called evil in this way, I can align myself with pre-modern sensibilities, especially those sensibilities of the biblical and classical world, that something can be evil because it is defiled. The one way in which my sensibility is not pre-modern is that I have no tendency that I'm aware of regarding the experience of evil as a consequence of divine judgment, punishment of an individual. However, in one important regard, my sensibilities are indeed pre-modern, at least if we take Paul Ricoeur at his word. I very intentionally include categories of defilement, violation, and stain as meaningful experiences of evil. To quote the character Shane at the end of the eponymous film, killing leaves a mark on a person. Shane's explanation of his fate is repeated in full at the end of the very recent film, Logan, so such a judgment still makes sense to a good number of people. One difficulty in talking about the individual's experience is deciding what kind of expressions are representational and in what way. All forms of first-person writing and works of art communicate to some degree, but no one can claim that our strongest experiences can be communicated using any kind of symbolic means. The fact that personal experience lies beyond our perceptual or deductive horizons, and this is true for our greatest joys as well as our greatest sorrows, is a jarring, frustrating, and occasionally despair-inducing fact of life that each of us must come to grips with as we live through more and more of the mystery of our lives. Although what I'm about to say is childish, I know, I'm going to say it anyway. Sometimes I feel a kind of wistfulness about the fact that God gets to be perfectly expressed in his incarnate word. I do not think it a minor thing to be promised the beatitude of being known, of knowing as we are known. I place a great deal of hope in the fact that because we do not know how to pray properly, the Spirit supplies our prayers. The Spirit groans for us. The Greek word is stegmagmos, only occurs one other time in the Bible. The Spirit groans for us. It does not supply for us the words of Euclid's Elements or the solution to that, or a grossly list, or even any scripture. It groans. Right now, I will offer you a kind of parable which guides all that I have to say to you tonight and which can serve as a common hermeneutical lens. When I was 23, and in the MDiv program, and dropping something, when I was 23 in the MDiv program, I had to do some a pastoral unit. And what I did was I was a chaplain in a hospital. And it was my job. I had a certain ward assigned to me, and I would go and visit the people there. And then on one weekend out of the month, 2 of us would stay in the hospital for 8 hours straight and cover whatever happened. And one Sunday, both of us were called to a code blue, a cardiac arrest. And when we showed up, the patient was dead. Now, the patient was a 24-year-old woman who lived, I was in Toronto at the time, who lived in Thunder Bay, which is roughly equivalent to living in Iron Mountain, Michigan. And she and her 26-year-old husband and 2 children had been watching football that Saturday afternoon. And she went into the bedroom and lay down for a nap and never woke up. They helicoptered her down to Toronto, where they discovered that she had had a brain hemorrhage. They did the surgery, and then after the surgery, she went into cardiac arrest and she died. It was my job to tell the 26-year-old man that his 24-year-old wife and the mother of his 2 kids was dead. The other chaplain had the task of telling her parents. I can remember quite clearly that walk around and around the hospital ward, trying to explain the fact that she was probably born with a weak blood vessel in her brain, and one of these days it was just going to go pop. Now, that has been my hermeneutical lens for understanding life ever since. As a little footnote, I would like to say that I think it's a ridiculous and stupid idea to have 23-year-olds wandering around a hospital trying to talk to people who are dying of cancer or who are about to go through commando reconstruction of a jaw or anything horrible. 23-year-olds have no business there. I didn't. Part 2. I begin my class on good and evil, the class I told you about, with the students, who are mostly sophomores, reading Euripides' play Medea. The story of Medea, the mother who killed her own children out of anger, was for more than 1,000 years the go-to text to illustrate the dangers and enduring trauma of unchecked passions. There are other issues that the play illuminates, but what causes an instant hush in the classroom when I talk about it is when I say, Medea reveals the truth that the first place that one usually experiences evil is in the family. In that sentence, I have, as it were, hit too close to home. I don't make the observation that we usually experience evil first in the family as a sociological statement or as a political statement. I am neither a Marxist nor a progressive. I make it first as an existential statement about a deep structure of our lives. For how can we not talk about family when family is all that we got? I make the observation that the first place anyone experiences evil is in the family in order to identify just how radical our openness to the experience of evil is, how inescapable such experiences are, and to emphasize the fact that there is a recognized, if largely unacknowledged, historical consensus that to talk substantially about the experience of evil, we turn to stories about the family as the mechanism of the setting. In fact, all I can claim to be offering here is to be bringing to our attention what we already know. What I'm going to say is that when we really want to reflect upon the experience of evil, we turn to the family as its setting. We all know that everything has gotten so much worse when we hear the words, "Luke, I am your father." The ancient Greeks recognized the deep ambiguity of the power of the family to affect. In ancient Greek legends, family was the tragedy and vice versa. Everyone who mattered was somebody's father or son, someone's mother or daughter. The oldest Greek mythology depicts Kronos devouring his own children and Zeus becoming all ruler by killing his father. For the Greeks, the change of seasons was a dynamic within a family. In 2006, the poet Louise Gluck published a magnificent piece on the abduction of Persephone by Hades and the response for mother Demeter, which was to withhold from the earth sunshine, warmth, and fertility. This is how we get the seasons. I have already referred to the Oedipus legend and to the much older legend of Medea. Anything else I could say about the Greeks' need to talk out the powers of the family can be exemplified by referring to the Orestean trilogy of plays by Aeschylus, in which King Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia to appease the gods. Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife and Iphigenia's mother, murders Agamemnon. And finally, the son, Orestes, kills his mother in retribution for her killing his father. Some of you are old enough to remember a TV show called The Sopranos. Everyone in the family except Iphigenia has done something evil, has experienced something evil. But the last play in Aeschylus' trilogy is about who in the family is to be judged as guilty. Who can measure a father's pain, his self-destruction really, for sacrificing a child because the gods required it? Who can measure a mother's pain for the loss of a child because some larger community needed that life? Who can measure a child's pain when one parent turns against the other and plots their destruction? It came as a surprise to me, a big surprise, to recognize that accepting the creation and fall material, Genesis 1 to 3, all of the book of Genesis is a collection of stories that reveal the varieties of evil one encounters in a family. The Genesis account of human life outside of Eden begins with the story of one brother murdering another brother and ends with the story of 11 brothers selling a brother off into slavery. Genesis 6 reports, in an abbreviated way, the existence of a parallel and depraved species of family, the union of angel and human woman producing offspring. And this notion of an unnatural family will receive development in the Enochian tradition and further development in Gnostic myths of the origin of the eons and the three generic types of humans, all defined by their genealogies. Those of us who descended from Adam and Eve, those who descended from Adam and Lilith, and those who descended from Lilith and the Archons. The story of the naked, drunken Noah being seen inadvertently by his son Ham alerts us to the minefield of taboos existing within the family, which are later defined by Deuteronomy and Leviticus. The story of Abraham and Isaac is so familiar that I need not repeat it here, but only to acknowledge its existence and its enduring significance. Personally, I do not know if the full resonance of the Epistle to the Hebrews can be heard without knowing the story of Abraham and Isaac. I want to follow this thread in the Pentateuch just a little bit further. In the book of Exodus, the story of Moses begins with his mother and sister leaving him to the kindness of strangers. Moses is taken in by an Egyptian princess who raises him as her own. In a religion and nation so dependent upon genealogy for its community and faith, Moses' own family history is at best troublesome. Small wonder, then, that when Moses leaves Egypt after the deaths of the Egyptian firstborn, that, and most of this is a quote, at a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So the Lord left Moses alone. Then it was that she said to Moses, "You are a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision." Until Moses became a bridegroom of the blood, his son's blood at that, the Lord was going to treat him as an Egyptian and kill him as one of the firstborn males. In that little room containing two parents, their child, and the presence of God, A mystery of danger, violence, and family is acted out. We recognize the actors' different roles, mother, wife, father, husband, etc., and understand that something weird and powerful happened. But that's about it. I mentioned to you earlier that past common readings for our group have included 2 works by Gregory of Nyssa. And Gregory's name has been invoked today in our meetings. So for several reasons, it might be useful for me to turn to his writings for elaborating the points I'm trying to make here. For the family as the site of inevitable personal suffering, pain, and grief is a strong topos in Gregory's theology. The problem of parental anguish, in particular, is a theme that remains with Gregory throughout his literary career. It is present in the early work, Life of Macrina, when he gives his account of his mother's crushed response to the death of her son. More importantly, and on the death of infants, likely the last work Gregory wrote, he feels the necessity to explain why it is that God allows the death of newborn infants. Gregory argues that marriage is an extremely painful experience, which virginity, we would use the word celibacy, allows one to escape or avoid. Gregory gives an honest, if one-sided, description of married life. A man falls in love and marries, and eventually his wife becomes pregnant. This occasion for joy contains sadness, however, for it is all too possible that the wife will die in childbirth. Survival statistics for women giving birth to children did not drop below 60% until the 20th century. Perhaps the wife doesn't die, but the child may. Both of them may die. Even if the mother and child survive childbirth, then it is all too possible that the child will die in infancy, and that the next pregnancy, or the one after that, will end in death for the woman. Gregory goes on. Sometimes it is the woman whose bridal joy is swept away by the death of her husband, and she suddenly has to take the name of a poor, lonely widow. Death comes in an instant and changes that bright creature in her white and rich attire into a black-robed mourner. Occasionally throughout the book, Gregory uses terms and phrasings borrowed from tragic literature, all justified by recognizing marriage as a tragedy. One scholar doesn't like the fact that Gregory uses tragic language, but I think that the verbal echoes are meant to intimate Gregory's insight. If marriage did not carry such hopes for comfort and joy, its reality would give us no pause. The reality of marriage is this, according to Gregory: sad, hurting, all the more sad and hurting, all the more tragic, because the expectation for comfort and joy is so great. At this point, Gregory turns the Stoic description of marriage into a revelation. The human point of contact with the human hope for love is in fact the entryway into deep pain, an entryway into separation, not union. Looking at marriage, Gregory says, and I'm quoting him, "You would see there, if only you could do it without danger, many contraries uniting, smiles melting into tears, pain mingled with pleasure, death always hanging over the children that are born and putting a finger upon each of the sweetest joys." Thus, according to Gregory, human existence itself is haunted by its own doppelganger, in which joy slides into sadness. We each exist, Gregory says in a famous passage, as moral doubles. Psychologically, this doubleness means not only that there are two opposite forces at work in us, life and death, but more importantly, that experiences of love, experiences of life and delight, inevitably contain and dissolve into their opposite, the experience of abandonment, experiences of death and sadness. As anyone who has read Gregory's On Perfection or his fifth sermon on the Beatitudes, raise your hands. knows such dissolving opposition is at the heart of our conception, that is to say, our being conceived, which means that it is the guarantee of our death. As Gregory said in his early work on virginity, the very sweetness which surrounds the lives of lovers is the spark which kindles pain. The first time I visited Oxford, I found scrawled on the wall of a pub's restroom the graffiti, "Life, sexually transmitted, 100% fatal." I was amazed to see that Gregory had traveled so far north. Before I conclude, I want to turn briefly to a contemporary articulation of the tragic in ordinary life. In 1991, Russell Banks published the novel Sweet Hereafter, so titled, I think, to invoke an ironic alternative to the anything but sweet here and now. The novel is the story of the aftermath of a school bus accident that results in the deaths of all the children in a small New England town. The chapter I am interested in the account, is given by Billy Ansell, a character Billy Ansell, a man who lost his wife to cancer 4 years earlier and lost their 2 children, twins, in the bus accident. As Billy speaks of his trauma, he explains the events by connecting them to his experience as a soldier in the war in Vietnam. In Vietnam, dying was everywhere, every moment of every day. When, as a 19-year-old, he left the war, he returned to normal life with the confidence that he had left dying everywhere all the time behind. Approaching the dead bodies of his children for the first time, he realized, and I'm quoting Banks, "There was death, and it was everywhere on the planet, and it was natural and forever, not just dying perversely here and now." And what had been the exception was now the rule. This is what Ansell calls the Vietnamization of his life. A more contemporary idiom would be to speak of a Fallujahization or a Kandaharization of life. Ansell's new consciousness of the omnipresence of lurking evil is a good example of how we experience evil now, simply directly, but over and over again in our memory, our sense of the experience enriched, as it were, through repeated recollection. As the voice of an understanding of life, Ansell's reaction expresses the truth of how such a catastrophic loss, such suffering is experienced. While we might hope to give him hope, one could not try to take away or steal his grief. This is who we are. Conclusion. For many, the best way of thinking of evil is the following: the limits of our autonomy, whatever one takes those to be. Evil appears as obstacles to be overcome. Evil is a force so powerful and ungoverned that it must be accorded a life, if not a mind of its own. I make the case that evil denotes that open-ended set of events that causes injury, pain, and enduring trauma, typically physical and emotional pain, more often just the latter. What qualifies as evil is, from my perspective, much more than what many theologians think of as evil. Evil exists for us primarily in the realm of our personal experience of suffering. The experience of evil is unavoidable, both because of who we are and what we are, but we are the creatures of pathe, passion. There's so very little that is under our control. I observe that the first experience of evil usually occurs in the family, which is a paradigmatic case of all that is not under our control. You didn't pick your parents, and they didn't pick you. And that to substantially talk about the experience of evil, we turn to family as the mechanism or the setting. I have treated the fear of death and the grief of perceived death as the root examples of our encounter with evil in this world. In this regard, I have largely followed Gregory of Nyssa and Augustine, albeit more implicitly than explicitly, particularly in the case of Augustine. There used to be a conceited kind of one-liner joke that went something along the lines of, if Jesus is the answer, then what is the question? I think that this sophomoronic attempt at wit actually and quite accidentally sums up the proper task of theology pretty well. Augustine thought that the economy of salvation was God renouncing the steamroller of his power as the means to that end. I imagine someone who is not just hanging on a cross, but nailed there as being powerless. Mind-numbingly, terror-inducing powerlessness. I think the question that Jesus is the answer to is indeed just that, our experiences of powerlessness in the face of all that we can lose and in the face of all that we are continuously losing moment by moment and all that we will lose. If I may indulge in two Christological notions that have been much maligned in the last few decades, I would invoke the Passion on the cross as Christ's kenosis. Kenosis as a self-emptying of power and majesty, and in the sense of what he, Christ, is due, of identity. But on the other hand, it is not a loss of identity. It is an ultimate affirmation. God, while all-powerful, is not primarily identifying with or as power. An image that we are, it points to the terrifying fact that as his image, it is as his image that we are in possession of very little power, and all our pursuit of it is illusory or futile. Love, so displayed in powerlessness, reconfigures our sense of the good, reconfigures our sense of the significance of suffering, of evil thrust upon us. In the words of my favorite modern theologian, who recently is deceased, Leonard Cohen, love is not a victory march. It is lost and lonely. Hallelujah. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time for questions. Yes.
I'd like to run something by it, and you can tell me whether I'm way off or not. But I've come to the conclusion that there's a formula for evil, and it goes back to, I believe, Genesis 3, and it's the three questions that Satan asked Eve, or the three statements that he said. Hath God said, did God really say you'll die? Surely you won't die. And then he said, well, you'll be as gods. And if you look at all the people who have done the most terrible things in the world, they doubted God's word. They didn't believe that they would suffer any consequences for doing these terrible things. And they saw themselves as a law unto themselves. So in my mind, I think the formula for evil is really in those three things that Satan told Eve. What do you think?
I don't want to have a formula for evil. Okay.
To recognize it,
yeah.
To confront it.
Well, okay. I don't disagree that that is one important way of recognizing some kinds of evil. I, in class, tend to describe that event as a seduction. You know, it tells you how important you are, it tells you that you're right, and it tells you that there are no consequences, and my room is just down the hall. So it's a kind of seduction of Eve. That's how I see it. But I don't disagree with you. I just don't want to say, okay, this is the formula for evil. Though I'm not telling you I think you're wrong. I'm just saying I'm hesitant about that one formula.
Okay,
Okay?
all right.
Okay. Paul?
Michelle, I like the way you started this out by sort of separating out the evil as having somebody to blame for it, that side, and then the just word realization that we're totally passive to something outside of our control. Don't you think really in experience, don't you think in experience, we kind of, those are all jumbled up together for us. You know what I mean? We like you use the situation of the young woman in Toronto dying, and what the husband's experiencing there. And you're trying to rationalize it somehow for him. You know, and so often is who is to blame and so forth and so on. But at the end of the day, it's just this random thing that's happened.
Right.
It's like evil is just like chaos, and
It's like
the
Vietnam.
morality and the illusion of it are all just sort of,
I think the combat zone analogy that Banks offers in the novel, I used to have a Facebook page where I said the really private things, and it was entitled, "If I Die in a Combat Zone." I was not in any danger of dying in a combat zone, but I was in danger of dying in some kind of combat zone. That's what it felt like. Part of the stupidity of having a 23-year-old put in that situation is that I did try to rationalize it. You know, I did try to take away this man's grief, to try to use the jargon, to try to shut him down, basically. I mean, I comforted him by saying, hey, I got an answer for you, which is a truly ridiculous, cruel thing to do to anybody. And that was what we were being taught as pastors, which can say something about why people don't go to church. But what I learned, and I don't know when, somebody hurts, you don't shut them down. You know, I mean, you let them say their piece, you listen, and you don't offer easy answers. You don't offer any answers except, I'm here, and I know you're going through crap, and I don't want to say anything which takes away from that fact. That's all you can do.
to follow up. One of the most haunting texts in the Old Testament is the death of Jephthah's daughter in Judges. You know, it's a classic case of what in the heck is going on here? And interpreters historically have struggled with it because they want to find somebody to blame. So we got to demonize Jephthah for making a stupid decision that ended up in the death of his daughter. But then from the daughter's side, it's just this random, horrid fate, you know, that's been thrust upon her by her father, another family tragedy. You know, it seems just total randomness, total chaos, which is one reason, again, it's been interpreted in different ways, and everyone's still trying to figure it out.
The scene in Exodus that I referred to about Moses being attacked by the Lord,
Right. Circumcision.
commentators do somersaults trying to make some sense of that. You know, I mean, why is the Lord trying to kill Moses? And the language, the Hebrew that's used, is not circumcision. It's cutting off the skin. I mean, it's not the technical term for circumcision. It's a tough little story that's just stuck right in there, and it's kind of like driving by a car accident, and then you go, oh, wait, there's somebody back there. So, yeah, there are stories. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
So with that story about the combat veteran losing his children in the school bus accident, are you insinuating in that story that in modern America we have lost our sense of evil because we have lost our sense of death surrounding us? Or is that something I'm reading into it?
I hadn't thought of that, so I guess I wasn't insinuating it. Okay? I can agree with both of those statements about losing a sense of evil and losing a sense of death. I'm not quite sure they're connected, but maybe they are. Okay? But at least I'm not guilty of insinuating that. Okay? I can learn that. I can learn that from you, but I wasn't insinuating.
Well, to continue Isaac's question, or to rephrase Isaac's question.
Your name is Isaac? Yeah. Cool. What's your father's name?
Not Abraham.
Okay. Do y'all have goats? No. Okay.
But you can, Gregory, or up to the 20th century, 2/3 of pregnancies end up in somebody's death.
Right.
By the age of 5, the vast majority of children are dead.
Right.
By the age of 15, they're orphans.
Right.
So we live in a world in which we live with the illusion of control. We have power, of healing, of science, of protection, of all those things. So the world we inhabit perhaps creates for us the illusion of control over evil or control over suffering, and therefore we don't know how to respond to it or to receive it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, coming back to Isaac's question, maybe we have gotten too small an idea of evil, too specific an idea of evil. And one of those 2 or 3 that I listed at the beginning and said, I don't mean that, because I don't, okay? It's been limited to that kinds of discourse, you know, I mean, philosophies and ideologies that will push one of those 3, okay? I think that that's the problem, is that our idea of evil has been so focused that we don't have a preferential option for the mortal, okay? And everybody's dying. I mean, I'm sorry, okay? It's happening. By the time I was 30, I knew 3 people under the age of 30 who had died of a brain aneurysm. So, and I will tell this story, and I have permission to tell this story, so don't go boundaries, okay? My wife has had, since 2001, a brain tumor right there. And the first time, they operated to try to remove it by going through her nose and pushing through and then trying to scrape it off the gland. And they didn't get it all, so they did what's called gamma knife surgery. And gamma knife surgery is like radiation, except it's located in 3-dimensionally, so that it's pinpointed, okay? It's it's not like pouring radiation, it's like a laser. But the way but they've got to get your head to stay put. So what they do is they have this copper rectangle, and they put the bottom part on your head, and they screw it into your skull, here and here, here and here. And then they lock your head into this machine so that you can't move. And then they do the gamma knife. And she's gone through that twice. And well, I can't stay in the room when that happens. I think of this as an incredible case of evil. But well, I think of it as that what she has to go through, the life that she's been given, that tumor, that's evil, but she's done well. So.
I have a question for you. That's a question. How would you answer this if someone says that, quoting from the Book of Wisdom, they say, given that evil is so vast in our experience in our world, in our own lives, in this kind of vast understanding of evil, why shouldn't we eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die? And I was just curious how you would respond to that.
It's expensive to do that. It's very expensive. You max out your card so quick. Okay.
But should I?
Yeah. Should you max out your card and get another card, max it out, and keep going? See, I actually think that the occasions of evil are even more than we know in ourselves, okay? I think that many people carry within them a trauma or a suffering, and it's buried way down, and they don't know, okay? Or they try to keep it down there and live around it. So I would say that wisdom is actually minimizing the amount of evil out there because it's connecting it to just the evil that we're aware of, okay? Or the evil that we're willing to articulate, to face. The question, how do I answer, aside from the credit card answer, it sort of boils down to, really, why are any of us working to have hope? Okay, I mean, why is anybody hoping for hope? And the person who lives like there's no tomorrow has given up hoping for hope. Maybe the only real honest answer to that is grace. Okay? That for some reason someone can hope. And what that reason is as properly called grace as it's called anything else. That help? Okay.
If evil can exist as a category outside of sin, then how would you describe God's interaction, or how would you describe the difference between God's interaction with sin and God's interaction with evil, or lack of interaction?
Okay. I'm not, in my paper, I wasn't trying to sort of deny category of sin or that it's theologically significant or religiously significant, or I was trying to put it aside because for a lot of people, their religion turns out to be this. Okay, don't do this. Okay, I tell my undergraduates on the first day of class that this is a theology course, but I promise you I will never do this to you. Okay, so I think that that sin is a legitimate category. The first thought I had when you asked the question was to go to the Psalms of Lament, which, like Psalm 22 or 42 through 45 or 88. And these are psalms in which the person is saying, so where are you, God? Okay, like, you used to be around, and now, you know, we're getting our asses kicked by the Persians, and now we're being told, oh, that's because you didn't worship properly. That doesn't make any sense. Where are you? And the majority of scholars say, well, when you have the Psalms of Lament, then really what they're doing is they want to get to the good part. Remember what I said about romanticism, which is, yeah, the psalmist talks this way, but at the end, there's a theophany, or there's worship or something. No, I mean, I think that is a case of trying to bury the feeling by saying, well, the psalmist obviously did something wrong. Now he's saying, I did something wrong. And when he does that, God will appear and everything will be fine. I have absolutely no idea. And I've been doing theology for, like I said, I've been teaching for 35 years. So since I was 22, which was what, 12 years ago. So I have no idea how God is going to judge any of us according to innocence and guilt. I have absolutely no idea. I try not to go there. I mean, I don't know. I can't figure it out. I mean, I don't know if there is some secret hatred or inside someone that never gets expressed, but lives there. How's that relate to stealing or lying or armed robbery? Okay. For God, is it sort of, well, you've been acting out, so you're guilty. Over here, no. I don't know. I mean, it could be. I mean, God is spirit, And maybe the things that are spiritual bug him the most, and not the physical thing. I don't know. But I have no way of adjudicating how that's going to work, okay? How some interior thought or disposition is going to be balanced against, okay, not even against an evil, against a good, okay? I know a woman whose husband, her first husband, was a pastor, and he was a good pastor. And unfortunately, whenever he would get friction from the congregation, which pastors get a lot, he would take it home and he would take it out on her. Okay? And she normalized it for about 10 years and then realized, no, something's wrong here. Mostly because he was starting to do it to the kids. The kids were getting old enough that they were becoming his target too. Here's this guy. I testified, or I don't know if testified is the right word. I had an interview with his bishop, telling the bishop what I knew had happened. The congregation was told. At one point, he got so angry at confirmation that he picked this kid up and threw him across the room. The congregation stuck by him. Now, I know what I think of him. I think he's going to fry. I'm perfectly happy to think that some people are going to fry forever. I'm from the South. We fry everything. Okay, so I don't say burn. I say fry. But I'm perfectly happy to think that that's going to happen. But then, somebody in his congregation could go, "Oh no, Reverend so-and-so, when my mother died, he was right there for us." Or I know for a fact that when a man in his congregation committed suicide by blowing his brains out, literally, putting the gun, and he wore one of those wool hats, somehow thinking this was going to keep everything together, and his brains were blown all over the wall, and this pastor was the one who cleaned the brains off the wall. Now, I still hate him, but I don't know how that's all going to come out, okay? The fact that there are people in the parish who he's helped at certain moments. He cleaned the brains off of the wall, the home where a man committed suicide, so his family didn't have to do it. The cops don't do that for you, okay? The coroner doesn't do that for you. He did that. I'm quite happy to leave his judgment to God, because I don't know how it works. Okay, I'm confident that this guy is a sinner. Confident about that. I'm confident of that about me too. Okay, but I'm not going to go, he's going to fry, even though I wish he would. I don't know. I mean, how do you balance out that incredible evil of violence against actually being a 60% good pastor, which when you get out in the real world, a 60% good pastor is, okay? I mean, you wouldn't buy a car that was 60% pastor, but 60% good. But if you get a pastor who's 60% okay, count yourself lucky. Okay. I used to go to church with, are you old enough to remember Walkmans? Yes, have you seen them in the museum? Okay. I used to go to church, and when the sermon came along, I knew it was going to be so bad that, this is true, I would take the Walkman out, the headphones. Back then there were no plugs, okay? I mean, yeah, those big things. And I would turn my Walkman on, and I would listen to music during the sermon. I sat in the back of the church, tried not to bug people, cut the volume down, but I would listen to talking heads speaking in tongues. And I thought that that was a perfectly appropriate bit of music to listen to in church. I mean, speaking in tongues, right? Okay. So I'm sitting there going, burning down the house. And just because this pastor, bad. If any of you are pastors, I'm really sorry. I will say something bad about other professions, social workers, lawyers. And on that note.
We have time for one last question. Yes.
So, we have faith in God because we've seen his goodness, and we know it to be a reality. It's not blind fideism. So, if we're not skipping to the good part of the story, if we're not trying to skip to the end, how do we approach our faith in God? How do we have faith in God if we're not trying to skip to that good part?
Okay. If you have faith because you've seen or experienced the good part, then that is the particular grace that God has granted you. And don't think of it as being integral to your faith, okay? God has given you the kind of faith in which you can enjoy that faith here and now. But for most people, I'm willing to say, most Christians, for me, that kind of joy is on the other side, okay? We live in between times, okay? We live between the fall and the return. And so that's where I'm at. If you've experienced the joy, then that is something that God has given you that is not the same thing as giving people faith or hope, because some people, many Christians live waiting, okay? They've not been given that grace. God has gone a different way with us, okay? Does that help? I like the tie.
Thank you. Would you help me thank Dr.